Hi, everyone. How are you? All right. There's some people outside that are still coming in there. So I'm going to talk to you today about Vellum. Now, I'm going to try to attempt to give you the 5 key elements that you need to learn Vellum in under 30 minutes. So this is going to be a challenge, but I think we're all going to leave here with a much brighter idea of how Vellum works and how you can get Vellum to behave for you the way that you want it to. So I am not a technical person, believe it or not. I don't do all of the what paper did I see to integrate this solver that allows these constraints to have iterations. I don't know. That's not me. I read those things the best that I possibly can, and then I turn them into real-world practical talk. So I'm going to talk to you today about how to make things stretchier and crumblier and more wrinkly and less slippery. And I'm not going to talk to you today as much about what the nth iteration of the constraint needs to be, right? So if you're looking for a super technical talk, they're all over. Go find one. So I do want to talk just a little bit about what Vellum is. Who here, I usually do this little survey beforehand, but I'll do it now. Who here is a Houdini user for under a year? Okay, who here is a Houdini user from 1 to 5 years? And more than 5 years? Okay, so we have a little mix of people. So we will have some more technically savvy folk here. That's good. Walking wounded, carry the dead. That'll be handy later. But I do want to say, how many of you of all that group, regardless of how long you've been using Houdini, how long has anybody been using Vellum? How many of you have played with Vellum before? Okay, a few. Awesome. One of the biggest challenges that I hear from people when we talk about Vellum is how do we get something to look like a real-world object or a real-world thing, right? How do I create silk versus leather versus spandex out of a piece of cloth? So that's primarily what we're going to talk about today. But I do want to mention that there are a bunch of different areas in which Vellum works. We can do grains, we can do soft bodies, you can do string simulations, which also feeds into hair simulations, hair and grooming simulations. So all of that is practical, but today we're going to talk about it in terms of cloth. And the things that I'm explaining, the technical aspects that I'm explaining in these real-world terms, cross-apply to all of these different areas of Vellum. Okay, so the solver and the way that the constraints are set up when we start talking about that, all of those principles apply to all of these things, whether it's soft bodies, grains, strings, or cloth. But because of the limited time, we're just going to talk about them in reference to cloth today. So, Vellum cloth in 30 minutes. Here we go. There are 3 key principles that you need to know when you're discussing how to create cloth inside of Vellum in Houdini. Now, I figured these things out not on my own, but with a lot of conversations with our technical directors, our in-house people. So I'm kind of taking a conglomeration of all of the inputs that I've got from them and distilling them down into these 3 key pillar principles. So tailoring, material properties, and the cut of the cloth. So these are all things that are actually real-world things. If we were on Project Runway, it'd be Tim Gunn saying this is a make-it-work moment, right? So these really are things that you would use when you're building real garments inside of the real world. So what is tailoring when we talk about tailoring? Well, when we talk about tailoring, we're talking about the actual pattern that makes up the cloth, the real-world shape that we're going to cut out of a particular material, also how it is sewn together. How strong are the bonds where it is sewn together, and how does it behave once it's in motion? So tailoring is all about the cut of the material, right? If we look inside of Houdini and we start talking about what that looks like, here is a shirt pattern that was actually brought into Houdini directly from the interwebs, and this is just a cutout of a shirt pattern. All of those pieces were just brought into the background image of Houdini, and curves were drawn to make those shapes. And then from there, we define where we want our seams to be. So we just say, hey, we're going to seam along this particular edge right here. And once we get them all seamed together like we want, we can go ahead and bring them all together into one unified piece of cloth. Now, I'm actually running this real time. This is not a video recording, so I'm in Houdini right now. So this is a speed at which you can expect performance from, this is a pretty simple shirt, but this is the kind of performance that you can expect out of Vellum. So, very simple. You start with an actual real-world pattern, figure out where you're going to sew it together, and then allow it to actually sew itself together. Now, what does it look like if we start adjusting patterns on things, right? So here is a model that I have. She does a little runway walk where she turns down, does a little pose and then walks down the runway and turns. And I got to thinking, what if we had a dress that was a shorter sort of dress like this, and we actually compared that to another cutout, like an actual different pattern that had a much more bell-shaped skirt with a lot more material on it. So all we've done here is we've changed the actual cut, right? The tailoring of the outfit. And what we end up with is something that looks like this. So the garment on the left uses a shorter length pattern, while the garment on the right has a little bit more material around the base and a little bit longer material. So the only thing that changed here in all of the simulation and all of the creation was I edited about 4 points and added some more garment in the tailoring of what I was building, right? So totally different, obviously, totally different behavior out of the cloth, even the cloth around the waist, where before we have the extra material added, you'll notice more pull happening in that area because we've added more weight to the bottom of the garment. So something to be aware of whenever you're creating these pieces of cloth in Vellum, the tailoring, right? Do consider tailoring. So that's number one. Number two is the material properties of what it is that you're tailoring. So is that dress made out of silk? Is that dress made out of denim? Is it made out of leather? Is it made out of spandex, right? All of those things, regardless of how it's cut from the fabric itself will actually lend to its behavior more than anything else. So we need to understand how it is that we adjust the properties of the material of the cloth that we're actually using. So this is where we get into some of the fun Houdini things. So there's a few basic concepts that we need to understand about Vellum cloth. So let's dive inside Houdini here and start looking at some of these and talking about this. So the way that cloth works, cloth is actually let me frame up on this here. Cloth is actually a simulation or a solver that uses point position and constraints or information between those points, almost particles, right, like particles, to determine how they're going to behave. Now, there's really only 5 things that you need to know about that system in order to get it to behave like any of the materials that we just talked about, leather, denim, spandex, whatever it might be, whatever the cloth is that you're trying to create. So let's talk about how these things move, okay? So the first thing is your cloth has the ability to stretch, right? If it's spandex, you would take it and you could pull it, and then when you let go of it, it would recoil back into its shape, but it would allow itself to stretch, right? As opposed to something like, let's say, a denim, like your jeans. Your jeans may have just a little bit of stretch, but they're not going to allow themselves to stretch a far, far distance. So stretch itself becomes one of the key factors of Vellum. So this is just a 2-dimensional example of cloth, right? This is just a line, and there are 1, 2, 3 points on this line. And when I play this, you can see that these points have been allowed to stretch. So they bounce, their position, the relationship between the points is allowing that line to stretch, right? Which would, if we had an entire grid full of points or a bunch of triangles out there, each one of those points talking to each other would allow them to stretch a particular distance. Well, what we do to adjust that is we come down to stretch and we adjust the stiffness. So stretch, stiffness. And basically what we're saying is the bond between the points on that line, how stiff or rigid is that bond and how much stretch do we allow? So the less rigid the bond between the points, the more that it's allowed to stretch. Okay, so how do we control other elements of cloth? Well, there's also something called stretch compression stiffness, right? Technical term, stretch compression stiffness. What does this mean? Well, the idea is if points exist in space at a particular place and they compress, how likely are they to stay compressed? So for the real world example of this, I like to think about like a bev nap at a bar, right? One of the little napkins. You pick up one of those little napkins and you crumble it up with your hand and you drop it on the bar. Once it's been compressed into a particular shape, it might expand just a little bit, but it has a real tendency to want to stay in that compressed shape, right? So the wrinkliness of it is what we would call stretch compression stiffness. Okay, so that's it. Those are the only 2 things you need to know about stretch. How stretchy is it? How elastic is that thing? And if I do compress it, how likely is it to stay in that compressed state? So the example that I have for that is simply if we crush these points up with a very high compression stiffness, Let me see. Wait, am I in the low? Yeah, I'm in the low. No compression stiffness. You'll notice that it bounces for quite some time. So we crush it up and it's allowed to recoil and bounce quite a bit. If we rewind the timeline and enable compression stiffness, it bounces a little bit, but it immediately tries to retract back up to its initial compressed state, and it stays at its compressed state. Okay? So crushability, wrinkleability, however you want to call it, but that's what we're adjusting when we adjust compression stiffness. Now, the other major thing about the motion of cloth that we need to be able to control is how does it bend? Okay? So think about something like a tablecloth. A tablecloth itself, you could actually bend it, and when you bend it, it will very easily bend and then fall back into its original position. Not compression, not elasticity, but actual bending. Right? So almost like the angular rule set that's defining how those curves can bend, not move linearly, but angularly. Okay? So for that example, we take a look at something like this line. All right, so we're talking about the bending of the points. You notice these points don't stretch in distance further away. They're about the same radius from the point above it where it typically is, but they're allowed to bend at a certain rate. Now, how bendy is something is what we call bend stiffness. So with something that has a lot of bend stiffness versus something that has a little bend stiffness, then you're talking about something that might recoil back into its initial shape a little bit less off of the actual bending property. So imagine a rubber floor mat in a car. A rubber floor mat in a car, you could roll it up into a roll, like you would stick it in your backpack, and as soon as you lay it down, it uncurls itself and immediately becomes, or tries to become, its flat self again. Okay? Now compare that to something like tinfoil. If I had a sheet of tinfoil laid out and I began to roll it up, and as I roll it up and drop it, I could drop it on the ground and it would remain inside of its curled shape. Right? So it has a very low resistance to being curled. It'll curl all day long, as opposed to a rubber mat, which is very resistant to curl. So that is what we call bend stiffness. All right? So that's great. We've seen all of this on a line, and we've talked about it in real world terms. But what does this actually look like? So again, here we are inside of Houdini, which I always get chastised for. Everybody's like, record a video. I said, no. I don't want to record a video. So if we look at what this looks like, this is a default sort of setup for our cloth. So this is a character walking through our cloth. Okay, so what happens if we take this and we adjust some of these key factors that we just talked about? Well, on my Vellum Cloth setup, I can come in here and I can really lower the stretch stiffness. And if I do, that's going to create something that looks more elastic, right? So immediately you can see that the fabric just stretches under its own weight and becomes almost like putty, right? So this would be something like a really, really soft sheer material, as opposed to if we increase the stiffness to something really large and rewind and play the simulation. Not only do we not get much movement there, but as the character actually hits the cloth and goes through it, it retains the distance between the actual triangles and between the points retained to a point that now it looks like we're dealing with a sheet of leather as opposed to a piece of silk, right? So, stretch stiffness. The other thing that we talked about was bend. Let's go ahead and just adjust bend for a little bit so we can see what a real world version of what bend is going to look like. So with our bend stiffness, if we increase that to a much higher value, we'll just say something like 10, as our character walks through, regardless of how stretchy the material might actually be, we get something that looks a lot more, like I said, like a rubber car mat, where the entire piece of fabric is being influenced by even just a little bit of push in the middle of it, so it's maintaining all of its shape as it moves. If we lower the bend stiffness, we get a much more wrinkly fabric. So we can actually start to see some more of the detail of the character's outline, and we get a lot more bending happening around the torso area. So now we have a much more pliable material, maybe something like a tablecloth as opposed to a sheet of rubber, right? So with those properties in mind, just those three things we talked about, compression stiffness, bend stiffness, and stretch stiffness, you already have the ability to create the majority of the materials that you're going to want to create. Now, I can't teach you in the next 12 minutes all of the things about the individual break constraints, but I want to let you know you can tear this cloth, right? You can use this cloth in all kinds of different interactive simulations with fluids, with pyro, with whatever it might be. But I'm just trying to get you guys to a point where you can have these key elements that you can use to define the properties of a cloth to get a cloth to behave like you want. So the other thing that, and let me show you what this looks like in a couple of renders too, so this will make a little more sense. So in this animation, this is the exact same cut of cloth. It's the exact same model and the exact same shape. The only difference is that I increased the stiffness in the bend and the stretch on the material on the right. Wait, my right, your left. So that it looks more like a piece of denim fabric. So it's a stiff, more firm, resilient type fabric. On the far right-hand side, my left, your right, the silk material, all that I did was just the opposite. I lowered those two values down a little bit, and I increased the compression stiffness just a tad. So I made it more silk-like. In other words, I made it more flexible, more pliable, less resilient, and more crinkly, and the ability for it to fold up a little bit more. So it's more foldy and thin, which makes it look like silk. So what does all this mean? Well, it means that we've covered everything in the stretch tab and in the bend tab that you need to really know, which means the values in the stretch tab under the stretch stiffness setting, the more that you increase that value, the more of a leather-like look that you're going to get. Okay? So you want leather, jump into the stretch tab, increase your stiffness. You want to have a more spandex, bendable, flexy type material, jump into the stretch tab and lower your stiffness. Okay? So that control, instead of being labeled stretch tab, could be called on one end leather, on the other end spandex. Now you just can slide between them to kind of get the look that you want for that particular type of fabric. Okay? Compression stiffness, is it more like rubber or is it more like paper? In other words, the napkin example that we talked about, if I pick up a napkin and I crumble it, does it retain that crumble or attempt to retain that shape? Or does it easily fit back into its original shape? Okay? So more paper-like or more rubber-like. Compression stiffness, paper, rubber. If you look at the bend tab and you talk about bend stiffness, then we start talking about whether that material is allowed to actually have folds in it, wrinkles in it, right? So something like, is it more plastic? So a piece of actual plastic, like a thin sheet of plastic. I could take that sheet of plastic and I can actually try to fold it, but it's not going to let me roll up the corners or crinkle it up very well. It's going to try to retain its shape as much as humanly possible, its original rest position, right? As opposed to something like silk that I could put a silk handkerchief in my hand and really it's very bendable and very pliable and I can sort of just fold it into any shape that I want. Okay? So again, it's sort of plastic or silk. Think of that slider as plastic or silk. Now, the only things that we haven't actually talked about here were mass and thickness. And the reason for that is, you may be asking yourself, why isn't there just a preset that I can throw onto my cloth that says silk? And I drag it over and now it looks like silk. Or I have another one that I drag over, it's rubber, and I just drag it on there, and now I've got rubber material. Well, the way that Vellum actually works is that all of those values are based upon the individual communication between the points. That's what we call constraints. Well, that depends on the number of points in your model. Okay? That also applies to things like mass. So how heavy is the dress on the right? Let's say the dress on the right has 100 points in it, and each point weighs 1 pound. Okay, crazy, but let's just say that. It weighs 1 pound. So that means the dress on the right would weigh 100 pounds. So I've got 100 pounds, a very heavy, heavy, heavy version of this material. If I adjust my elasticity or my stretch stiffness to be very low, then that dress is just going to fall and collapse because it's very heavy, but it's allowed to be extremely elastic. Right? Now, if I do the same thing with the one on the left, it's just going to melt like a pile of butter because each point is still worth 1 pound, but now there's 10,000 points. Now that dress weighs 10,000 pounds. So if I want it to look like the dress on the right, then I have to go back through my settings and begin to really tweak them back a little bit because I've got much more weight to the dress on the right. Okay? And that just has to do, again, if you want a technical paper on how that works and why that is, I'm sure there's one around here somewhere. But I can tell you that you can't have just a default because we don't know, as the Vellum solver, I don't know what you're giving me. So I'm going to give each point a particular weight and a particular stiffness based upon the other points. But the other thing is, what if the dress on the right was 20 feet tall and made for a giant? Okay? Now that's going to make a huge difference in the way that the Vellum solver is calculated too. Because if I have a bunch of really dense points in something that's only 1 meter long, versus if I have that same exact number of points, but the thing is 100 meters long. Okay, so you have to really keep in mind that what we're doing is we're adjusting qualities of the fabric to make them look like a particular real world thing. Okay, which is why I like to look at this tab a lot, like this slide a lot. I actually have this just written down in Notepad. And anytime I'm working in Vellum, I just fire it up and have the Notepad open. So when I'm adjusting properties of cloth, I can go, yeah, that doesn't look like silk. It's not bending enough. Cool, what do I need to do there? Oh, the silk slider is that one. Boom, slide it over. Okay, now I can resim and it starts to look a little more like what I want. So that works for me. I hope that works for you in the same scenario when you're trying to adjust material properties of cloth. But keep in mind, like we talked about, the stretch and the bend and the compression stiffness, those things, and mass, weight, like we just talked about, all that stuff cross applies to no matter what it is that you're using, if it's cloth or if it's strings or if it's hair or any one of the types of the things that Vellum Solver can work on. All of those same properties apply. Now, it might not be, we don't have silk hair, but is the hair bendy or is it really sprayed with a lot of hairspray where it's really, really stiff? Well, if it's not bendy, then I'm going to take my bend stiffness and really crank it up a little bit. So you might have the same cheat sheet for hair somewhere, right? This is just one for cloth, but the same principles apply to anywhere inside of the Vellum Solver. All right? I also want to talk about the very last thing, and I've got about 5 minutes, which is perfect. The cut of the cloth. So every fabric and fiber has a grain to it in some way, shape, or form. Okay? And we talk about how that grain works and whether or not a square of fabric, so imagine those are bed sheets on the far left-hand side. If you cut the fabric in a square with the grain and then hang it up on 2 points and shake it, it will behave completely different than if you cut it across the grain. Okay? And the reason is because when gravity pulls on an object, the bonds that actually hold those pieces together to allow them to be bendy or stretchy or compressed or not are completely different, completely stronger or weaker based off of the way of the direction that the fiber runs when gravity pulls on it. And you might say, well, that's pretty subtle. I mean, can that really make all that much of a difference? So I did a simulation, the same thing, with one of them cross-cut and one of them not cross-cut. And we had a little bit of a Janet Jackson, Justin Timberlake Super Bowl malfunction of wardrobe happen to us. Okay? Now, the reason that this happens, you don't see a lot of this effect here in the bottom part of the skirt. You see a little bit of it happening here. You see a little bit more folding, a little weaker element to the material happening here whenever we've cross-cut the fabric as opposed to cutting it right with the grain. But the majority of what you see happens on the shoulder. And the reason for that is because in the thinner parts of the material is where the weakness of a cross-cut garment will be most visible. Okay? Now, it's really hard to see in a smaller garment like that. So here is the exact same thing done on something that's about 2 meters in size, like so it would be a bed sheet. And the only thing that's changed in the simulation is that the grain of the fabric has been rotated by 45 degrees in the one on the left, and on the right it stayed directly with the same cut. Okay? So you can obviously see the points in the middle, which are not supported, are much weaker and begin to collapse in on themselves much more than the one on the left. So that can really change the way that a fabric is draped onto a character or draped into a sail of a ship. Like the way that it moves can really be affected by the cut of the material. And in Houdini, when we work with that cut, it's basically UV driven. So your object has UVs put on it. The direction and shape of those UVs, let me dive inside here real quick, are what drive that weft and waft or warping of the cloth, right? So really all this is a little JPEG that I made that looks like fabric that's been applied to this geometry so that it looks like the grain. Over here, I just rotated the UVs by 45 degrees so you get something that looks like fabric that's been cut that way. The background of what's actually happening here is just the fact that the UVs have been rotated by 45 degrees. Okay, so the direction of those UVs, once you actually change the direction of the UVs on your material, that's what's going to affect the Vellum simulation, whether it's weaker in those softer and thin areas, right? And all of that is enabled in one particular place, which is right here. We just say enable warp and weft. Enable warp and weft. And there you go. And now that the UVs will now actually impact the way that the Vellum solver works when it simulates. Okay? So there you go. 3 principles of cloth inside Houdini. Tailoring, the cut of the fabric, how much cloth am I actually working with, and where is it stitched and seamed together. Number 2, what is the material property that I'm working with? And what are the 5 key elements to material property? Stretch stiffness, bend stiffness, stretch compression stiffness, weight of the fabric is the biggest thing too, right? Because it's a per point. We've got to remember it's a per point attribute. So what's the resolution of my garment and how do I need to adjust the weight so that the garment is appropriately weighted for the rest of the simulation? After that, it's just a matter of, do you want to actually use your UVs to imply something like a more realistic simulation where you have a cut or a cross cut? Now, even at that, so I've taken 3 Vellum nodes, 4 different tabs on the Vellum nodes and about 22 parameters and given you 5 key parameters and 3 thoughts that you can use to actually adjust your Vellum. But even with all of that, don't fret, we have the guides. Almost like Arby's has the meats, we have the guides. So, for those of you, how many people in here have used N-Cloth before in Maya? Okay, I have a Maya N-Cloth to Vellum cheat sheet that goes through all of the elements in the parameter view versus all of the elements in the attribute editor and gives you a one-to-one correlation of exactly what is what. Okay, so even though you might only need those 5 key things that I talked about for very simple setups, if you need more complicated setups and you say, but in Maya I'd adjust this, how did I do that? We have, like I said, a one-to-one guide that goes through the solvers, it goes through the attribute editor. If you're interested in that, please come up and see me. I've got business cards and things, and we can talk about it. The other one is we actually have a guide that goes through about 12 different types of material properties. Leather, silk, all the things that I had just mentioned before, cloth, wool, cotton, a bunch of different ones. And we'll give you a breakdown and tell you how that cloth is made, what the fiber materials are in that cloth if you want to try to emulate it, and which settings inside the solver or inside the cloth setup you should be adjusting and in which direction you should be adjusting them to get more of a look for that fabric type. Okay? So basically it's the cheat sheet expanded into not every material in the world, but quite a few. So if you're interested in those, please let me know, and I can provide you with those. I'd be glad to share those, share them with everybody that you know. The other thing that's really great about Vellum, if you noticed, anything that I had done when I was inside of Houdini was all happening inside of SOPs. Not one time did I jump inside of Dynamics World to get anything done, which means at a studio, you can do everything that we just talked about, everything that I just showed, all the character effects that you, cloth effects that you want to create inside of Houdini Core, which means you don't need a full effects license to do it. So all of that functionality exists with inside of Core. So keep that in mind because it really becomes a powerful tool when you can do hair, fur, cloth, grains, all without having to spend the money on the effects package, right? You can all do it within Core. So keep that in mind too. And there you go, that's me. And that was Vellum in 30 minutes, 31 minutes. And there you have it. And I don't have my email address up here, but I'll type it out real quick if you guys want to take a picture of it. But I also have business cards. Feel free to come up and get them. Thank you, everybody. Have a good SIGGRAPH.